Welcome, investigator. Evil is on the rise. Crime is escalating. Our mission is to eliminate the crime by exposing evil, examine why it manifests, and highlight the brave souls that confront it every day. Join us as we work together to bring justice to every victim. Welcome to All Things Crime. Here's your host, Jared Bradley.
I imagine in the middle of the night, if he, wanted to dump her somewhere, and he probably pulled over and there weren't any lights from any direction that he could see, and so he probably thought that was a really, really remote place and dumped her there. That's, but it's pretty good indication that the fact that the husband, who, you would think would be the most intimate person with the victim, that he would be the one to report her missing. I mean, any kind of a real relationship, that would, you would think that would happen for sure with the husband, as opposed to, a family member from Mexico. That's pretty good indication. But like you said, the suspect, her husband, committed suicide in 2001, so 3 years later.
Correct.
And no indication of why he would have done that?
No indication there. I do know that occurred in Nevada, the state of Nevada. I believe it was ruled a suicide. Ultimately, it was an overdose. But there's no indication. There's no note. No indication of why, other than it was determined to be, a suicide. So, and I haven't actually looked at, police reports from that area. I've just seen the death certificate of him. That's what it was determined to be. So.
Interesting. So, 1998. Fast forward 20 years. You finally are able to get her identified. How did that happen?
So it was kind of crazy, actually. We had kind of hit dead ends on everything, right? We'd gone back to the evidence, retested things. We did isotope testing, which analyzes the hair of the victim or of an individual, identifies with like the water you're drinking and things you're exposed to that narrow down geographically where you were from or living. We had, gone obviously to NamUs, the missing person database, and kind of explored every way that we could. One of the things we also explored was the rope that she was bound with were a very unique, complex series of knots. And in fact, we've been working with even the FBI in regard to this case back in, I believe it was about 2012 when they started working with our department. That was before I was involved. But they actually suggested and recommended a knot expert who could analyze those particular knots and maybe try to find some kind of commonality or tie to other cases. And so this individual is retired law enforcement, and he was an expert with knots. And so again, the FBI recommended his services to us. We actually employed him to analyze this rope. So we went down that avenue as well, and that actually tied to some other, not to get too far off in the weeds, but we actually looked at an individual named Scott Kimball as a suspect for a time, who was a convicted serial killer serving a sentence in Sterling, Colorado for 4 homicides. There was several indications that would have pointed us in his direction. Namely his own admissions to a global plea agreement where there was a list of victims, murder victims that he was looking at, and some of those he was naming on this, of a list of several people. He probably indicated, 6 or 8 people that he had knowledge of regarding their death. This victim, on our case, which became known as the Maiden Water victim because it was found near the Maiden Water Springs area near Lake Powell. So Scott Kimball actually, indicated to put her on the global plea agreement. And this was working with authorities in Colorado and the FBI. There's other circumstantial things that, We could have put him in the area about that time frame. Several other things that tied us to Scott Kimball. Ultimately, he was ruled out, and we even conducted an interview of him out there in prison. So we explored a lot of every avenue that we could. So we got to that point where once we'd explored all of these avenues, we had this photo of the victim. And it was a photo that was taken at the medical examiner's office. It was not a graphic photo by any means. It was just of her face. She was deceased in the photo, but again, it was not graphic or gory in any way. And we felt like at this point, what do we have to lose? Let's release this photo to the public in an attempt to identify her. So we did a press conference here in Utah. This was in October of 2018. This photograph of the victim was released to the media, and about half the media outlets released the photo, and about half didn't, which is fine. So what occurred was, obviously our attempt was, we're trying to get tips from the public, right? And I started getting these tips coming in, getting called in. I was following up on the tips as they came along. Well, I got a tip from a citizen actually living in California who likes to these cold case type things she likes to get on and do kind of as a hobby. And she had seen our photo, and then she was looking in NamUs, this missing person database that's, as law enforcement, we can input information into it, and that there's information that's law enforcement sensitive. There's also stuff that's available to the public in an effort to identify people, missing people or loved ones. So she had made this connection with our photo, with this photo that Youngstown police had put in as a missing person from 1998. But the interesting thing was, initially when that missing person report was taken in 1998, there was no photograph of the victim to put in NamUs at all. But just prior to our media release, there was a detective, Detective David Sweeney in Youngstown, Ohio, who was working cold cases, and he had looked at this cold case. He's like, well, maybe if we could find a picture of her as the victim of a missing person, we could input that into NamUs. So he got looking into things, and this victim was from Mexico, so he contacted ICE, and ICE actually had a photograph of her from like immigration photo, and so he'd taken this photograph of the victim from Ohio and the missing person and put it in NamUs. Well, ironically enough, that happened within 5 days of us releasing this photograph. So after 20 years 20 years later, what's the chances of that happening? So whether you want to call that luck or something else. So initially when I got that information, I'm like, well, why did we never make this connection in NamUs before? It was because it was brand new, right? Because Youngstown had just put that information in thanks to Detective Sweeney. And the connection was made, and what looked really promising was she had a mole in her upper right ear. We knew that from our autopsy here, but ironically enough, in the ICE photograph from Youngstown, Ohio, you could see the angle from the photograph. They have her turning her head to the left. You can see that right ear, and you can see that mole in her upper right earlobe, which is pretty unique, right? So we figured it looked really good for our victim. So, but we still didn't have a way to really confirm it, right? We couldn't use fingerprints, so we had to try to find family members with DNA. So working with Detective Sweeney in Youngstown, they did a media release to Mexico, well, Texas specifically, in Mexico, with this photograph of their victim, of this Lina Reyes-Geddes, and this photograph went out from there, and a couple days later we get a phone call from a female in Mexico who only spoke Spanish, saying that she thought that was her sister. So make a long story short, we're able to communicate with her, and we were quite sure that was Lina. We were quite sure that she was a sister, but we needed to verify it, and that would have to be through DNA collection of the family, and then a comparison to our victim here, with the help of a lot of people here in Utah, Youngstown, and even Texas. I was working with an ATF agent on, we did like gun crimes, but he had a lot of connections and spoke Spanish, and he was my interpreter with his sister in Mexico. We are to make arrangements to collect her DNA in Mexico from a U.S. consulate there, with, and again, an ATF agent working in this consulate collected that for us. We helped we had to make these arrangements and send money to her, and so she could make this long bus ride to this U.S. consulate in Mexico. DNA was collected. It was sent here to us in Utah, and it was compared to our victim's DNA. And they worked pretty quick. The lab that we utilized here worked pretty quick. Within 5 days, we had a match. It was, in fact, we confirmed her identity. So a lot of things really came together for us. We want to call it luck or fate or whatever, but those photographs connected it through NamUs, the public, just a good tip, and then it's collaboration between Utah and Ohio. So that's how she was identified, and again, that's what opened up all these new doors for us.
Oh, that's awesome. There's a couple of things that I think are really important that as you're describing what how this victim was identified, which personally I think there's so many people that whenever anything horrible happens, a lot of times the primary focus ends up on the person that did it. And although that's really important to bring people to justice, I think whenever we lose focus on the victim, then I think that really does a disservice to not just the victim and the victim's family, but the whole community and society as a whole. Because ultimately, if we keep our focus on the victims, which I know you guys do, and that's one of the things that's unique really with law enforcement is, you guys always go after the bad guys, but a lot of times the reason you keep going, especially in a case that's 20, 24 years old, is because you know there's a victim out there that isn't identified yet, and this victim deserves, didn't deserve to end the way she did, but more importantly, or equally as importantly, she deserves to be, with her family and be able to be, buried with her family, and I know that was kind of part of it. And why don't you kind of finish that, because I think that the final ending of where Lina is now, I think is equally important.
Absolutely, you're exactly right. So, as you can imagine, once the family in Mexico realized, for 20 years they didn't know what happened to their loved one, their sister, their daughter, their loved one. Once we confirmed that, they were thankful to know where she was, but sad to learn what had happened to her. They suspected that something like that had happened. They just could never prove it. And so the family there, and namely the sister, her name was Lina Reyes, who's just a sweet, humble woman, wanted the remains of her sister to come back to Mexico. So logistically, that's tough to work out, right? So I had to work with various entities here to make this happen. As you can imagine, there's a pretty good cost incurred for travel and everything. The victim, Lina Reyes, she was in a cemetery here in the Salt Lake Valley, and we knew where she was. So in for the family's request, the sister's request, they wanted to come and collect her remains and take her back home to Mexico. And at their request, they wanted to be able to come here and then have her sister cremated and then take the remains back. So it took about 2 months to organize this, because we identified Lina in November of 2018. In January of 2019, we were able to secure, the visas, the travel, get all the approvals through the U.S. consulates. So we were working with the Mexican government and our U.S. consulates, and I'm really thankful to them, because it's not an easy thing to do. Her sister traveled here. We had to do various things with with the health department here in Utah for the death certificate and next of kin, and it took quite a bit of effort. We took her to the cemetery where Lina had been buried, and there's some pretty neat photos. And on our DPS News website, there's photographs of Lucero visiting her sister's gravesite, which was actually pretty emotional, as you can imagine, and for all of us that were very vested in this case. So she was able to visit that, spend the time that she needed to there. And once she was ready, then we worked with the mortuary to have her body that was disinterred and then prepared, and through the cremation process. And it took about a week or so to get to all of this, and so we were able to put just have her sister here in Utah in a motel. We just helped facilitate her for the week, and Utah Crime Victim Reparations paid for all this. Like, it's incredible that they paid to flip the bill for all the travel, all the disinterment, the cremation fees, everything, which was, as you can imagine, several $1,000s. So it was really, really neat to see people come together all over the place for this to happen, for this family to have closure. And then at the conclusion of her trip, she was able to take Lina's remains and then travel back to Mexico with them and take Lina home. So, and to me, being in this job now for 23 years, this is the most rewarding thing I've ever experienced in my job. It was just incredible to see that, and to see just to be able to, for this family to get closure. It was really pretty awesome, to say the least. So that was really, like you exactly are talking about these victims and their families, is it was huge, really huge.
Wow, that's fantastic. When this story broke, like I said, it's a dual pronged story. Solving the case and figuring out who the killer actually is one side of it. But on the other side, which I think to me, it didn't get quite as much play as, again, the media doesn't really focus on the victim and the victim's family side as much as I think they should, especially in a lot of these shootings and things in the bigger cities. But it's important that society knows that even if something horrible happens to you, that number one, guys like you will never stop until the case is solved and justice is brought to the victim. And it's there's 200, and I think the last count that I saw was 230,000 homicides that are unsolved in the United States. And that number is obviously way too big. But it's also refreshing to know that there's enough professionals, enough guys like you that are out there that, and gals, of course, and I'm kind of lumping everybody together, but just the of all the law enforcement that I've met all across the country, you guys, just the dedication that you do, and especially you're especially right now, you're probably in the most thankless job in anywhere in the country, and yet you still go to work every day and you dedicate to the community that you serve. And to me, it's just fantastic, and it's one of those things that and that's one of the reasons I do this podcast and the video cast, is just because I think you guys deserve a bigger voice than what you get, and you deserve a lot more credit than what you get. And I know you don't want it, but too bad. You have to have it. So
thank you. I do appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah. So no, that's a fantastic story, and I appreciate you sharing that with us. So that's the first half of actually identifying Lina and how she was discovered and all that. But then there's the other half of figuring out who actually killed her.
Sure. And
so
yeah.
Yeah. go ahead and so from there, this was a dual track, right? So once you discovered who the victim was, then that, like you said earlier, that kind of opened doors, right?
Absolutely, it did. And so, and we'd, obviously our hope was to completely solve this, but these cases are really tough. These cold cases are really hard to close and to solve. So after she was identified, which we were really thankful for, and like we talked about, so we turned our sights kind of back to the evidence. Okay, and certainly the background of Lina, her husband Edward, people who'd come forward and talked about concerns about Edward and things that he'd said and done, and maybe the kind of person that he was. It definitely wasn't enough for us to call him a suspect, but it was certainly enough to make us look at him, right? So, and the more we learned, the more we're like, yeah, this is the direction it was heading. But that's not enough to even really call him a suspect, or certainly not enough to close the case. And we could spend a lot of time going into all the details of that. But just suffice to say, there was a lot of circumstantial things that pointed toward her husband Edward.
Thanks for joining us. Your attention today brings us one step closer to exposing and eliminating the evil that brings crime to our communities. Hit subscribe and share this episode. Together, we will bring justice to every victim.